In a small, remote village nestled in the heart of northern Nigeria, there lived a butcher named Malam Aminu. He was a hustle-fulani man, known to the villagers for his incredible skill in slaughtering and preparing meat. His shop stood at the edge of the village, where the roads converged from the farthest corners of the region, and it became a central point of interest. Malam Aminu was unlike any other butcher in the area. His reputation was built not on the quantity of meat he sold but on the quality and tenderness of his cuts. It all started innocently enough. At first, Malam Aminu's meat was just like any other butcher's, fresh, savory, and perfect for cooking. But slowly, over time, something began to change. The meat that Aminu offered seemed to be unlike any other. People who tasted it began to rave about it. They couldn't quite put their finger on what made it different, but they all agreed on one thing: it was incredibly tender, flavorful, and unlike any meat they had ever tasted before. It wasn't long before his reputation spread beyond the village. Word of Malam Aminu's special meat reached neighboring towns, and people came from far and wide to sample what had quickly become the talk of the region. Villagers whispered in awe that his meat was so tender it almost melted in your mouth. Elders praised it for its richness, while young children would eagerly run to the butcher's shop, demanding their parents buy some. The butcher's shop was always busy, with people lined up to buy his cuts. There was always a long queue, sometimes stretching down the road, as everyone eagerly waited for their turn to purchase the coveted special meat. The butcher, with his friendly demeanor and welcoming smile, became a beloved figure in the village. He never seemed too busy to chat, and people would often stop by just to share a moment of conversation. His reputation for kindness matched the growing admiration for his meat. Over time, the villagers came to see him as a figure of trust and dependency. They relied on him for the best cuts of meat for their meals, and in turn, became a staple of their daily lives. He was always there, quiet, steady, and dependable. And so, the village flourished under the butcher's care. His meat became a symbol of prosperity, and any feast, no matter how small or large, was incomplete without it. Weddings, births, celebrations, and even mourning rituals, the butcher's special meat was the centerpiece. It became so ingrained in the village's culture that people began to associate the meat with all things good and prosperous. As Malam Aminu's fame grew, so did the villagers' trust in him. It wasn't just his meat they trusted, it was his word, his presence, and his role in the community. He was more than just a butcher, he was a pillar of the village, a man who could be relied upon in times of need. People would send their children to his shop, knowing they would return home with their hands full of fresh, tender cuts. The children loved it. They were drawn to the meat in a way that seemed almost unnatural. They would beg for more, sneaking pieces when their parents weren't looking, savoring every bite as if they had tasted something divine. But then, a troubling pattern began to emerge. At first, it was just one child, a young girl named Amina, who went missing. Her disappearance was barely noticed at first, as the village was accustomed to the occasional loss of life in a community where resources were scarce. But soon, others began to vanish as well, another child here, then another there. They were the children of the poorest families, the ones who could be easily overlooked. No one paid much attention at first, assuming they had simply wandered off or had been lost in the sprawling fields that surrounded the village. But as the disappearances continued, whispers of fear began to spread. It wasn't long before the families of the missing children started to connect the dots. They noticed that their children had been eating at Malam Aminu's shop shortly before they disappeared. At first, the connection seemed too far-fetched to be true. How could their beloved butcher, the one they trusted more than anyone, possibly be involved in something sinister? But the disappearances were becoming too frequent to ignore. There were questions that couldn't be answered. Where were the children going? What had happened to them? And why had they all been last seen near the butcher's shop? The village was becoming uneasy. The parents of the missing children began to gather in secret, speaking in hushed tones about what they feared might be happening. But still, no one dared to confront Malam Aminu. He was their butcher, their provider. He had brought prosperity to the village, and no one wanted to believe that he could be involved in anything sinister. One evening, however, a young boy named Hassan, the son of a local farmer, grew suspicious. He had always been a curious child, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Late one night, he decided to follow Malam Aminu after the shop had closed. He waited in the shadows, watching the butcher lock up his stall and walk toward the edge of the village, carrying a large bundle wrapped in cloth. Hassan's heart raced with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He followed at a distance, moving quietly so as not to be seen. The butcher led him deep into the woods behind the village, far from the prying eyes of the villagers. What Hassan witnessed that night would change his life forever. Malam Aminu, in a chilling display of cold calculation, unwrapped a cloth to reveal the body of a small child. The butcher stood there for a moment, gazing down at the lifeless body, and Hassan could barely contain his shock and horror. The butcher wasn't just slaughtering cattle, he was killing children, and the special meat that he had been selling to the villagers was the flesh of those he had murdered. Hassan fled back to the village, heart pounding with terror, but he knew that the truth was far too dangerous to share openly. He couldn't prove what he had seen, and the villagers would never believe him. After all, they had trusted Malam Aminu for so long. His fame was built on decades of goodwill and reputation. No one would dare question him. But Hassan couldn't stay silent. He confided in his best friend, a brave young girl named Fatima, who was equally horrified by what they had learned. Together, they planned to expose the butcher's secret. They knew they had to act quickly, before more children disappeared. But time was running out. The next day, the village was in chaos. More children had gone missing. The villagers gathered in the square, confused, angry, and frightened. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the village. As the realization began to set in, Malam Aminu's meat wasn't from cattle, and the children who had disappeared weren't just lost. The villagers now stood at a crossroads, caught between their desperate hunger for the special meat that had brought them so much joy, and the horrifying truth that their butcher had been feeding them something far darker than they could ever have imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the villagers faced a chilling question: would they finally confront Malam Aminu, or would they be forever trapped in his web of lies? Suspense hung in the air, the village divided, and the butcher's fate was yet to be sealed. The truth was out there, but would anyone have the courage to confront it before it was too late? Only time would tell.